Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax.
Dennis Blake arranged the plaster casts on the folding table in order of discovery, each one labeled with precise coordinates and timestamp. 7 footprints, each telling an impossible story. The first showed a human foot, size 9 men's hiking boot with a distinctive Vibram sole pattern. The second, found 30 feet northeast, showed a coyote's paw. The third showed what appeared to be a barefoot human print, but with the toes spread impossibly wide and an extra digit. The fourth was back to the hiking boot. The fifth showed a bird's talons, far too large for any raptor native to Arizona. The sixth showed the coyote paw again, but this time it was reversed, as if the animal had been walking backward. The seventh showed something Dennis had no name for, a print that seemed to shift under direct light, its contours refusing to remain fixed. He'd been a ranger at Canyon de Chelly National Monument for 14 years, and in that time he'd documented black bear tracks at elevations where black bears didn't exist, found pictographs that predated accepted carbon dating by 3,000 years, and once recovered a hiker who'd survived 5 days without water in 110-degree heat. Dennis prided himself on finding logical explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena. The pictographs had been misdated due to contaminated samples. The bear was a released zoo animal that had wandered. The hiker had found an unknown seep spring. But these tracks defied every logical framework he possessed. The makeshift laboratory, really just the ranger station's break room with the furniture pushed aside, smelled of plaster dust and the chemical tang of fixative spray. Dennis had set up his digital microscope, his UV light source, his reference materials. On his laptop, he had pulled up databases of every known animal track in the Southwest. Nothing matched. Outside, the September sun was baking the red sandstone cliffs of the canyon to temperatures that made the air shimmer. Inside, the AC unit rattled and wheezed, barely keeping the room at 80 degrees. Dennis was 42, thin and meticulous, with wire-frame glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose and a tendency to talk to himself when working through problems. "Okay," he muttered, photographing the third cast from multiple angles. "Let's assume we're dealing with a hoaxer, someone deliberately creating false tracks. But why? The area where these were found is 3 miles from the nearest trail, accessible only by technical climbing. No tourist is going that far for a prank, and the substrate analysis shows consistent depth and pressure distribution. These aren't pressed in by hand. Something walked here." His phone buzzed. A text from Chief Ranger Maria Alvarez. "Any progress on the Mills case?" Dennis grimaced. Angela Mills, 29 years old, professional photographer from Santa Fe, specializing in Native American cultural sites. She'd obtained all the proper permits to photograph the restricted areas of the canyon, had checked in with the Navajo Parks and Recreation Department, had followed every protocol. She'd been documenting a series of ancestral Puebloan pictographs in a remote alcove on the North Rim when she'd vanished 6 days ago. Her camera had been found 4 days later, 2 miles from where she should have been, sitting on a flat rock in direct sunlight. The SD card was intact. The battery was dead. When Dennis had reviewed the images, he'd wanted to throw the camera into the canyon and forget what he'd seen. He pulled up the photos now on his laptop, forcing himself to look again with clinical detachment. Image 1. The pictographs. Beautiful work, clearly ancestral Puebloan, showing the typical handprints, spiral patterns, and animal figures. Timestamp 7:23 a.m. 6 days ago. Images 2:15. Detailed shots of the pictographs from various angles. Professional quality. Nothing unusual. Timestamps 7:25, 7:45 a.m. Image 16, a self-portrait of Angela. Smiling, red bandana holding back dark curly hair, professional camera vest, the canyon stretched out behind her. Timestamp 8:02 a.m. Image 17, the first wrong image. Another self-portrait, same angle, but Angela wasn't alone. Standing behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the alcove, was a figure. Human-shaped, but wrong, too tall, arms too long. The face was a blur, as if it had moved during the exposure, but Dennis could make out what might have been eyes, reflective, catching the light like an animal's. He'd shown this image to Maria Alvarez. "Probably another hiker," she'd said, though her voice lacked conviction, "or a lens artifact." Dennis had spent 3 hours analyzing the image. It wasn't a lens artifact. The figure had depth, cast a shadow, occupied physical space. And in the metadata, something odd. The camera had taken this photo in full automatic mode, but the settings made no sense. The ISO was maxed out at 6400 despite bright sunlight. The shutter speed was 1/8000th of a second, impossibly fast. The aperture was f32, stopped down as if photographing something incredibly bright. Image 18, timestamp 8:04 a.m. Just 2 minutes later, this photo showed Angela's hand held up to the camera, palm out. In the center of her palm was a symbol, drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal. Dennis had sent the image to an anthropologist friend at Northern Arizona University. The response had been terse. "That's not pictographic. That's a skinwalker curse mark. Where did you find this?" Dennis hadn't responded. He didn't believe in curses. Images 19 to 47, a rapid sequence of photos taken over the span of 4 minutes. These were harder to explain. In them, Angela was running. The camera angle was shaky, unfocused, but Dennis could make out the landscape. She was moving down the canyon, away from the alcove. In several frames, he could see her shadow on the red rock. Except the shadow was wrong. It moved independently, sometimes in the opposite direction of her body. In image 32, her shadow had 4 legs. In image 40, the shadow had wings. By image 47, taken at 8:08 a.m., there were 3 shadows cast by one body. Images 48 to 52. These photos were taken from a low angle, as if the camera was on the ground. They showed the sky, cloudless and impossibly blue, and in each photo, circling overhead, was a bird, the same bird, a raven from the silhouette. But the raven appeared in the exact same position in each frame, despite the photos being taken over a span of 30 seconds. Image 53. The camera was moving again, being carried. This photo showed Angela's feet, her hiking boots on red sandstone, and next to them, a set of coyote tracks. The tracks matched her stride perfectly, appearing and disappearing in sync with her footsteps. Images 5473. Pure documentation of impossibility. In these photos, taken over 15 minutes according to the timestamps but showing light conditions that suggested hours had passed, Angela photographed her own transformation. Her hands becoming paws, her shadow detaching from her body entirely and walking away. Her reflection in a puddle showing something with antlers. A close-up of her eyes, the pupils vertical slits like a cat's. The final image, number 74, was taken at 9:47 a.m. It showed the canyon from a high vantage point, at least 300 feet up on the cliff face. No human could have climbed there in that time frame. The photo was perfectly focused, professionally composed. And in the bottom right corner, Dennis could just make out what looked like a paw, not human, not quite canine, resting on the rock. After that, nothing. The camera's battery had died or been turned off, or simply stopped recording reality as Dennis understood it. "These aren't real," Dennis said aloud, for perhaps the 100th time since seeing the images. "They can't be real. Photo manipulation, digital artifacts. some kind of elaborate hoax. But the metadata didn't lie. The images had been taken in camera with no post-processing. The EXIF data was clean, showing no signs of tampering, and Dennis had examined the camera itself. A Canon 5D Mark III, professional grade. No malware, no custom firmware that might produce corrupted images. He'd sent the SD card to a forensic lab in Albuquerque. They'd confirmed it. The images were authentic captures, not composites or manipulations, which left Dennis with an impossible conclusion. The camera had accurately recorded something that shouldn't exist. His phone buzzed again. This time, a call. Maria Alvarez. "Dennis, we've got another situation. Hikers just reported finding clothes on the White House Trail. Women's clothes. They match the description of what Mills was wearing." Dennis felt his stomach drop. "I'm on my way." The White House Trail was one of the few paths in Canyon de Chelly accessible without a Navajo guide. It descended 600 feet from the canyon rim to the floor, winding past the iconic White House ruins. Popular with tourists, well-maintained, heavily trafficked. Not the kind of place where people vanished. Dennis made the hike in 40 minutes, moving fast despite the heat. The sun was directly overhead now, turning the canyon into a furnace. The sandstone radiated stored heat, making the air feel solid. He passed a group of tourists heading up, their faces red and sweating. The clothes were arranged on a flat boulder near the ruins themselves, laid out with almost ceremonial precision. Dennis recognized them from Angela's permit photo. Olive green hiking pants, a white technical shirt, sports bra, underwear, socks. The hiking boots sat beside them, laces neatly tied. Everything was clean, as if freshly laundered, except for the smell. Dennis bent closer, his nose wrinkling. The clothes reeked of wet dog and something else, something musky and wild, like the inside of an animal's den. "Don't touch them," he told the hikers who'd found them, a retired couple from Ohio. "Did you see anyone else down here? Any signs of where these came from?" "Just those," the woman said, pointing. "Tracks, leading away from the boulder, heading deeper into the canyon." Dennis photographed them carefully, then followed. They were human prints, barefoot, the right size to match Angela Mills. But something was wrong with the gait. The stride length varied wildly, sometimes 18 inches, sometimes 6 feet. In places, the tracks seemed to skip over sections of ground entirely, as if the walker had simply ceased to exist for several feet before reappearing. Dennis followed them for half a mile until they reached a section of the canyon where the walls narrowed to barely 15 feet across. Here, the tracks ended at a sheer rock face and went straight up it. He tilted his head back, tracing the impossible path. The barefoot prints continued up the vertical sandstone, each one clearly visible in the afternoon light, defying gravity and basic physics. They climbed 200 feet, then disappeared around an overhang. Dennis stood there for a long moment, his carefully constructed rationality crumbling. "No," he said firmly. "There's an explanation. Climbing equipment. She had gear that wasn't found. She used ropes, adhesive, something. But Angela Mills hadn't checked out any technical climbing equipment. Her permit listed only photography gear." Dennis turned and nearly walked into a man standing 3 feet behind him. He hadn't heard anyone approach. The man was Navajo, elderly, his face a topographic map of wrinkles. He wore traditional turquoise and silver jewelry, dusty jeans, a plaid shirt. His eyes were dark and knowing. "You're Dennis Blake," the man said, not a question. "Yes, I know who you are. I'm Thomas Begay. I used to guide in this canyon before my knees gave out. I know every inch of this place. I know its secrets." "Mr. Begay, I'm in the middle of an investigation." "You're in the middle of something you don't understand," Thomas interrupted. "That woman, the photographer, she went where she shouldn't have gone. Photographed things that don't want to be photographed. The pictographs. She had permits, not the pictographs. The alcove where she went, that place is forbidden, has been for generations. There are sites in this canyon that we don't preserve, that we don't protect, that we don't show to outsiders. Places we deliberately let erosion claim, because some things should be forgotten. Dennis felt irritation rising. Mr. Begay, I appreciate your cultural concerns, but I'm trying to find a missing person. She's not missing. She's changed. Thomas fixed him with those dark eyes. You've seen the photographs. You know what I'm talking about. Yi Naldlushi, Skinwalker. She's walked the path now, whether she meant to or not. That's not real. Skinwalkers are mythology. Are they? Thomas gestured at the footprints going up the vertical wall. Explain that with your science. Explain the photographs. Explain how she left her clothes behind and walked away on bare feet through a 100-degree desert without dying of exposure. Dennis opened his mouth and closed it again. He couldn't explain those things. You want to find her? Thomas said. You need to understand what you're looking for. Yinald Lushi. They're witches, rangers who broke the taboos, who performed forbidden ceremonies, usually involving the death of a close family member. They gain the ability to wear skins, to transform, but they're not invincible. They're still partially human, and they're always hungry. Not for food, for life, for energy, for the heat that lives in living things. This is folklore. You keep using that word like it means not true. Thomas smiled without humor. Folklore just means old truth. Knowledge passed down because it kept people alive. You think the Diné people survived in this desert for thousands of years without understanding what shares it with us? A gust of wind came down the canyon, bringing with it that same wet dog musk Dennis had smelled on the clothes. Thomas tensed. It knows we're talking about it, he said quietly. They always know. You need to leave this canyon now, tonight. Don't come back. I can't do that. I have a job. Your job will get you killed. Thomas turned and started walking back toward the trail, over his shoulder. Don't go into the side canyons after dark. Don't follow sounds that might be voices. And if you see an animal watching you, really watching you, with intelligence, run. Don't look back. Just run. He disappeared around a bend in the trail, leaving Dennis alone with the impossible footprints. That night, Dennis did what he always did when faced with inexplicable phenomena. He researched. He sat in his small apartment in Chinle, laptop open, reading everything he could find about Skinwalker legends. The Navajo were reluctant to discuss it, he discovered. Most websites were run by white enthusiasts or paranormal investigators, their information dubious at best. But he found a few academic papers, anthropological studies, linguistic analyses of the original Navajo terms. The picture that emerged was consistent. Skinwalkers were witches who gained their power through a profound violation of Navajo ethics, usually the murder of a sibling or parent. They could transform into animals by wearing the pelts of those creatures. They moved with impossible speed. They could mimic human voices. They fed on the living in ways that weren't clearly defined, but always resulted in wasting sickness or death. And they were associated with a specific type of witchcraft called the corpse poison way, involving the desecration of graves and the use of bone powder. Dennis fell asleep reading, his dreams filled with images of Angela Mills running on all fours through the canyon, her shadow detaching and reforming, her face becoming a coyote's muzzle. He woke at 2:17 a.m. to scratching sounds on his window. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of his laptop's sleep mode. Dennis lay perfectly still, listening. The scratching came again, rhythmic, deliberate, like nails on glass. He reached for his phone, turned on its flashlight, and aimed it at the window. A coyote stared back at him from the exterior ledge, which was impossible. His apartment was on the second floor. The coyote opened its mouth. Dennis, his name, spoken in Angela Mills' voice, coming from the animal's throat. Dennis, I need help. I'm trapped. I don't know what happened to me. Please, open the window. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible. Coyotes couldn't climb to second-floor windows. Coyotes couldn't speak. This had to be a dream or a hallucination brought on by stress and desert heat. But the coyote tapped on the glass with one paw, and the sound was absolutely real. "Please," it said again, and now Dennis could see that its eyes were wrong. They weren't the yellow-brown of a coyote. They were hazel, human. Angela Mills's eyes, set in an animal's skull. He got up slowly, approaching the window. The coyote tracked him with those human eyes. "Angela?" His voice came out as a croak. "I don't know what happened. I was photographing the site and I felt strange, dizzy. Then I was running and I couldn't stop. Dennis, I can't change back. I can't remember how to be human. Please help me." Something about the voice was wrong, not the fact that it came from a coyote. Dennis had moved past that impossibility. It was the cadence, the phrasing. It was Angela's voice, but not quite Angela's speech pattern. "How do I know you're really Angela Mills?" he asked. The coyote tilted its head, a disturbingly human gesture. "What do you mean? Who else would I be?" "Tell me something only Angela would know. Something from her permit application." I don't remember, Dennis, please, I'm so confused. Everything is jumbled. Let me in and I can explain. Angela listed a next of kin on her application. Who was it? The coyote's mouth opened wider, showing too many teeth. "Why are you being like this? I need help. I need to get inside where it's safe. There are things in the desert, Dennis, things that hunt." "Who was her next of kin?" Dennis repeated, his hand on his phone, ready to call. Whom? Animal control, the police. What would he even say? The coyote stopped pretending. Its body language changed, becoming more predatory, less desperate. When it spoke again, the voice had changed. Still Angela's tone, but with something else underneath. Something cold and ancient. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Ranger, or maybe just more paranoid. That's good. Paranoia keeps prey alive longer, makes the game more interesting." "What are you?" "I'm wearing Angela Mills, or pieces of her. The parts I needed, her voice, her scent, her memories, some of them anyway. The rest I've eaten or set aside for later. I can wear you too, Dennis. Would you like that? We could share a skin, walk together, hunt together." Dennis backed away from the window. The thing that looked like a coyote pressed closer to the glass. "You're thinking about running," it said. "That's instinct. But where would you go? I can smell the roads from here, taste the direction of your car. I'm faster than you, faster than anything with just 2 legs, and I'm so very hungry, Dennis. Do you know what hunger is? True hunger? Not the small want of a missed meal, the emptiness that consumes from the inside. The need that hollows out everything you are until there's just hunger wearing your shape. The Angela Mills I saw in those permit photos had a mother," Dennis said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Susan Mills, listed as emergency contact. You didn't know that, because you're not Angela. You're something that took her." The coyote laughed, a sound that should have been impossible from that throat, but it came out perfectly, terribly human. "Clever boy. Yes, I took her. But slowly, you understand. Not all at once. First just a little, just a taste. She walked into that alcove and I offered her a trade. Power for permission. The ability to see as animals see. To run as they run. To understand the secret languages of the wild. She said yes. They always say yes when you offer them something they want. You tricked her. I offered her a choice. She chose. What happened after? Well, that's the nature of transformation. You can't become something new without losing what you were. Angela Mills walked into that alcove. Something else walked out. Something that's still learning how to wear human memories like a coat. The thing pressed against the glass, and Dennis heard it crack. "Last chance, Dennis. Open the window. Let me in. I'll make it quick, or I can make it slow. I can peel away pieces of you over days, wear your face while you watch, show you what you look like from the outside as you disappear from the inside. The choice is yours. Dennis grabbed his car keys and ran. He made it to his truck, started the engine, and was pulling out of the parking lot when something landed on the hood. Not a coyote now, something larger. A mountain lion maybe, but wrong. Too long in the limbs, too aware. It spoke through the windshield. Running just makes me hungry. Dennis floored the accelerator. The thing on his hood held on as he swerved wildly, trying to dislodge it. At 40 miles per hour, it finally lost its grip and tumbled off into the darkness. In his rearview mirror, Dennis saw it stand, not like a cat, like a person wearing a cat's body as a costume that didn't quite fit. He drove to the ranger station, called Maria Alvarez, and tried to explain. She listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. "Dennis," she said when he finished, "I'm going to say something you're not going to like, but I need you to listen. The Navajo Nation police have been investigating parallel to us. They found evidence that Angela Mills may have been involved with a group researching Native American ceremonial practices. Not academics, outsiders, people trying to recreate certain rituals. Skinwalker rituals." A long pause. "Yes. You believe it? You believe she actually became something?" "I believe," Maria said carefully, "that there are things in this world that don't fit into our usual frameworks. And I believe that Canyon de Chelly has been sacred and forbidden in equal measure for a reason. The Navajo police have asked us to suspend the search. They're bringing in a specialist, someone who deals with these situations. A medicine man. A Hatawi, yes. He'll arrive tomorrow. Until then, Dennis, I need you to stay away from the canyon. Stay in public places. Don't go anywhere alone." Dennis spent the rest of the night in the ranger station, all the lights on, doors locked. He dozed fitfully in an office chair, jerking awake at every sound. Dawn came slowly, the darkness giving way to purple and orange. Dennis stepped outside as the first rays hit the canyon rim. The air was already warming, promising another scorching day. Something was different. It took him a moment to realize what. All the birdsong had stopped. The usual morning chorus of ravens and canyon wrens was absent. The silence was total. Then he saw them. Animals emerging from the canyon. Dozens of them. Coyotes, ravens, jackrabbits, lizards, even a pair of bobcats. They moved in a coordinated mass, flowing like water over the landscape. And they were all headed directly toward the ranger station. Dennis backed toward the door. The animals stopped at the edge of the parking lot, forming a perfect semicircle. They didn't make a sound. They just watched. Then they all opened their mouths and spoke in perfect unison, in Angela Mills' voice. "You can't hide from someone who wears the world as a skin." A truck pulled into the parking lot, a battered pickup with Navajo Nation plates. An old man got out, moving with surprising speed. He wore traditional clothing and carried a bundle wrapped in red cloth. Thomas Bigay. He looked at the assembled animals, at Dennis, and nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "Get inside," he told Dennis. "Now." Dennis didn't argue. Together, they retreated into the ranger station. Thomas unwrapped the bundle, revealing several items. A pouch of corn pollen, eagle feathers, what looked like carved bone artifacts, and a leather-bound book covered in symbols Dennis didn't recognize. "You've seen it," Thomas said. "The Yi-Naldlushi. It's fixated on you now. That's bad. They're patient hunters. It could stalk you for months, years even, wearing different forms, speaking with different voices. You'd never know which animal to trust, which person might be a skin it's borrowed. How do we stop it?" "Stop it?" Thomas almost laughed. "You don't stop them. You survive them. You respect them. You protect yourself." He began drawing symbols on the floor with the corn pollen. "This will help, but only here, only now. You need to leave this place, Dennis. Find another job, another canyon. Don't come back I can't just abandon. Yes, you can. Pride keeps rangers in dangerous situations. Pride gets them killed. The Skinwalker has tasted your fear. It knows your smell now, knows your routine. It will hunt you in ways you can't predict. The only defense is distance and protection. He held up one of the bone artifacts, a carved figure that might have been human or might have been something else. This is made from yucca bone. Very old, very powerful. It confuses them, makes it hard for them to track. Wear it always. Outside, the animals were moving closer. They pressed against the windows, silent and watchful. What happened to Angela Mills? Dennis asked. The real Angela Mills. Is there anything left of her? Thomas's expression was grim. In the beginning, yes. A piece. The Skinwalker wears her, but she's still in there somewhere, screaming, getting smaller every day as it digests her. Eventually, there will be nothing left but the Skinwalker wearing her memories like photographs. That's the mercy and the horror of it. She stops suffering only when she stops existing. One of the windows cracked. A raven's beak had punched through, creating a small hole. Through it came Angela's voice again, but distorted now, as if multiple versions of her were speaking slightly out of sync. Dennis, please, I'm still in here. You can save me. You just have to let me in. I can explain everything. I can show you what I've learned. The boundaries between things aren't real. Skin is just a suggestion. You could be so much more if you'd just let me teach you. Thomas completed the protection circle and stepped back. The corn pollen glowed faintly in the morning light, or maybe that was Dennis's imagination. When I open this door, Thomas said, you run to your truck. Don't look at them, don't listen to them. Drive south and don't stop until you're out of the Navajo Nation. The reservation boundaries offer some protection. Traditional magic has geographical limits. Beyond that, wear this always. He pressed the bone amulet into Dennis's hand. And never, never speak its name. Names have power. The more we talk about them, the stronger they become. What about you? I'm an old man. I've had a long life, and I know ways to deal with these things that you don't. I'll buy you time. Use it wisely. Thomas opened the door. The animals surged forward as Dennis ran. He felt claws scrape his jacket, teeth snap near his legs. Something that might have been Angela Mills' voice screamed in rage and hunger. But he made it to his truck, gunned the engine, and tore out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he saw Thomas standing in the doorway of the ranger station, arms raised, speaking words Dennis couldn't hear. The animals were converging on him. Dennis drove south, his hands shaking, the bone amulet burning cold against his chest where he'd tucked it under his shirt. He crossed the reservation boundary at dawn, marked by a faded sign, leaving Navajo Nation, drive safely. The silence followed him. Dennis Blake resigned from the National Park Service 2 weeks later. He moved to Tucson, found work as a wildlife biologist with the University of Arizona. Indoor work, mostly lab-based, analyzing other people's field data. He never went back to Canyon de Chelly. Thomas Begay's body was found 3 days after Dennis left, in his home in Chinle. Natural causes, the report said. Old age. Dennis knew better. He also knew that Thomas had bought him escape with that death, a trade made in traditional ways Dennis would never fully understand. Angela Mills was never found. The case remained open for 6 months before being classified as a presumed death due to environmental exposure. Her mother held a memorial service in Santa Fe. Dennis didn't attend, but sometimes late at night, Dennis's phone would ring. Unknown number. When he answered, there would be silence, then the sound of breathing, too slow, too measured to be fully human. And sometimes, if he listened long enough, he'd hear Angela Mills's voice, distant and distorted. I'm still learning, Dennis. Learning how to be. How many skins can one thing wear? I'm up to 17 now. How many until I remember how to be Angela? How many until I forget I was ever anything else? Dennis changed his number 4 times. It didn't help. The thing that wore Angela Mills had his scent, his pattern, his essence, and it was patient. He still wore the bone amulet. It hung cold against his heart, a constant reminder that some boundaries between human and animal, living and transformed hunter and prey, were thinner than science acknowledged. And sometimes when Dennis looked in the mirror, he wondered if his own reflection watched him back, with eyes that were a little too knowing, a little too ancient, a little too hungry. In the desert, things changed, and once changed, they rarely changed back. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? What do you think happened to Thomas Begay? The bathroom mirror reflected someone Stephanie Walsh barely recognized anymore. She gripped the sink's edge with both hands, knuckles white, trying to force oxygen into lungs that had forgotten how to process air properly. 5 years. 5 years since she'd watched Rachel fall, since she'd heard the rope snap with that sound like a gunshot, since she'd screamed her partner's name into the void of Yosemite's granite walls and received only echoes in response. 5 years, and the panic attacks still found her in fluorescent-lit bathrooms, in quiet moments when her guard dropped, in the spaces between heartbeats where grief lived permanently. The Grand Teton Ranger Station bathroom was small, clinical, smelling of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness that came from inadequate ventilation. Through the door, she could hear the normal sounds of the morning briefing winding down. Boots on linoleum, coffee mugs being refilled, the low murmur of Ranger conversations. July 2008. High season. The backcountry would be crowded with hikers, climbers, families chasing the American wilderness experience with inadequate preparation and unlimited optimism. Stephanie counted her breaths. 4 in, hold 7, 8 out. The technique her therapist had taught her. Rachel had been 29. They'd been partners for 3 years, lovers for 2, planning to leave the Park Service and open a guide company together. The rope had been rated for £3,000. It shouldn't have failed. The investigation found a microscopic manufacturing defect, a weakness invisible to inspection, a tragedy born from pure statistical impossibility. Sometimes Stephanie thought the impossibility was worse than deliberate malice. At least malice you could hate. Impossibility just was, cold and indifferent as stone. Her radio crackled, making her flinch. All units, be advised we have a 1078. Request for assistance, backcountry sector 7. Ranger Santiago reporting possible stalking incident. Alaska Basin area. Stand by. Stephanie's hands went numb. Amber Santiago, 23 years old. Graduated from Colorado State with a degree in wildlife biology 3 months ago, hired as seasonal ranger because the Park Service needed bodies during peak season, and she'd aced every test they'd thrown at her. Eager, intelligent, reminded Stephanie painfully of Rachel, not in appearance but in that particular quality of fearless enthusiasm that the wilderness hadn't beaten out of her yet. Stephanie had been assigned as her field training officer, had spent the past 6 weeks teaching her the same skills she'd once taught Rachel: route finding, emergency medicine, how to read weather patterns in the mountains' faces, how to stay calm when tourists panicked, had carefully maintained professional distance while simultaneously becoming more invested than she'd been in anything since Rachel died. And now Amber was calling for help. The radio crackled again. Following me. It's been following me since... Static consumed the transmission. Not an animal. Something's wrong with... More static. Then Amber's voice, higher pitched, breaking. Stephanie, if you're listening, I'm... A sound came through the radio that turned Stephanie's blood to ice water. Not quite a scream. Something worse. A sound of pure instinctive terror that predated language, that came from the part of the human brain that remembered being prey. then silence. Stephanie was through the bathroom door before conscious thought caught up with action. The main office held 6 rangers, all frozen, staring at the dispatch console where the transmission had originated. Chief Ranger Tom Brennan, 58 and weathered as the mountains themselves, held the mic with the careful grip of someone trying to squeeze hope from plastic and electronics. "Santiago, come back. Amber, do you copy?" Dead air. "All units, we have a possible 1033, Ranger in distress. Last known position." He checked the GPS tracking system. "Alaska Basin, approximately 11.3 miles from trailhead, elevation 10,200 feet. Santiago was conducting solo wildlife survey, scheduled return 1700 hours. Stephanie checked her watch. 09:47. Amber had been out there since dawn. "I'm going," Stephanie said, her voice steadier than she felt. Brennan looked at her with eyes that had supervised too many rescue operations, that knew the statistical difference between rescue and recovery. "Walsh, you're not cleared for solo backcountry response. Protocol requires a minimum 2-hour assembly time for SR team. Amber might not have 2 hours. We don't know what we're dealing with. She said something was following her. Could be a grizzly, could be a stalker, could be she's injured and disoriented. You go in alone, and we could end up with 2 rangers down." Everything Brennan said was correct. Stephanie knew this, knew the statistics, the procedures, the careful risk assessment that kept rangers alive in environments designed to kill humans. Knew that her PTSD, her history, her ongoing therapy were all documented in her personnel file with recommendations for limited high-stress assignments. But she also knew the sound Amber had made in those final seconds of transmission. Knew it intimately, because she'd made that same sound 5 years ago watching Rachel fall. "I can reach Alaska Basin in 4 hours if I push hard. I've got the training, the equipment, and I'm the only one here who knows that terrain from when I worked Yellowstone's backcountry." That was a slight exaggeration. The Tetons were different from Yellowstone's geography, but true enough. "Give me a radio check every 30 minutes. If I don't respond, then you send the full team." Brennan studied her for a long moment. Other rangers had gathered, 6 faces showing various combinations of concern and calculation. They all knew her history. Most had probably read the incident report from Yosemite, the one that detailed in clinical language how Ranger Stephanie Walsh had been unable to prevent her partner's death due to equipment failure beyond her control. 4 hours to reach her position," Brennan said finally. "Radio check every 30. You miss 1 check, I'm pulling you out and sending in the team. And Walsh," he waited until she met his eyes, "don't be a hero. If the situation is beyond your capacity to handle alone, you radio immediately. That's an order." Stephanie nodded, already mentally cataloging what she needed. Extended first aid kit, emergency shelter, extra water, high-calorie food, rope, harness, her personal climbing gear. The Alaska Basin Trail was brutal. 11 miles of elevation gain from valley floor to high alpine basin, crossing multiple ecological zones, exposed to weather that could shift from pleasant to deadly in 30 minutes. 20 minutes later, she was moving. The trailhead started deceptively gentle, winding through lodgepole pine forest along Teton Canyon's floor. Tourist families posed for photos near the wilderness permit board, their laughter bright and unconcerned. Stephanie pushed past them without acknowledgement, settling into the ground-eating pace that came from 2 decades of backcountry work, not quite running but faster than hiking, a sustainable rhythm that consumed miles while conserving energy for whatever waited at the destination. The forest gave way to steeper terrain, the trail switching back on itself, climbing. Stephanie's pack, loaded with emergency equipment, weighed 38 pounds. She barely noticed it. Her body had learned long ago to treat weight as extension of self, to move with the pack rather than against it. At 2 miles, the forest thinned. At 3, it disappeared entirely, replaced by the exposed alpine environment where only the hardiest vegetation survived. Krummholz trees twisted by wind, alpine wildflowers in their brief explosive summer, expanses of talus where nothing grew at all. The Teton Range rose around her in formations that made human concerns feel microscopic. Grand Teton itself at 13,775 feet, Middle and South Teton flanking it. Cathedral Group's jagged peaks cutting the sky like broken teeth. Beautiful, magnificent, utterly indifferent to human life. Her radio check at 30 minutes went smoothly. At 60 minutes, she was breathing hard but making good time. The trail followed Death Canyon, named with the frontier's characteristic bluntness, before branching toward Alaska Basin. Despite the name, the canyon was popular with experienced hikers, offering dramatic views and challenging terrain without requiring technical climbing skills. Stephanie had been here twice before, both times in her Yellowstone days when she'd occasionally worked joint operations with Teton Rangers. She remembered the basin itself as spectacular, a high-altitude bowl ringed by peaks, dotted with alpine lakes, home to pikas and marmots and the occasional mountain goat. Beautiful in summer, deadly in winter, the kind of place that demanded respect and punished carelessness with absolute efficiency. At 90 minutes, something changed. The temperature dropped, not gradually, as might be expected with elevation gain and changing weather patterns, but abruptly, as if she'd walked through an invisible membrane separating summer from deep winter. One moment she was sweating in July sunshine. The next, her breath was visible in air that felt like late November. Stephanie stopped, pulling out her emergency thermometer. 48 degrees Fahrenheit. That was wrong. She was at maybe 8,000 feet elevation. Even accounting for wind chill and cloud cover, the temperature should be in the low 60s at minimum. She checked the sky. Clear, brilliant blue, no clouds, no approaching front, nothing to explain the sudden cold. Her radio check came through normal. She reported her position, the unusual temperature drop, received confirmation and instruction to proceed with caution. Weather in the mountains could be freakishly localized. Stephanie had seen snowstorms hit one valley while the adjacent valley remained sunny. But this felt different. Wrong in a way her hindbrain recognized, even if her rational mind couldn't articulate why. She continued climbing. At 4 miles, she found the first sign that Amber had come this way. A piece of orange flagging tape, the kind rangers used to mark survey sites, tied around a stunted pine. Except it had been shredded, torn into strips that fluttered in wind that shouldn't have existed in this sheltered section of trail. Stephanie examined the tree itself. The bark showed deep gouges, 4 parallel scratches that went through the outer layer into the white wood beneath. She measured them with her fingers, 6 inches long, spaced about 2 inches apart, angled downward as if something had raked claws down the trunk with considerable force. Bear, her mind suggested. Grizzly marking territory. But the spacing was wrong for bear claws, too wide, and bears typically left marking scratches higher up on trees, standing on hind legs to advertise their size. These marks were at shoulder height for a human, maybe 6 feet off the ground. She photographed them with her digital camera, bulky 2008 technology that felt inadequate compared to what she knew would come in future years, and continued. The cold intensified. By 5 miles, frost-coated exposed rocks despite the sunshine. Stephanie's breath came in white clouds, her fingers going numb inside her gloves. This was impossible. Thermodynamically impossible. The sun was shining directly on her. She should be warm, should be fighting heat exhaustion, not hypothermia. At 6 miles, she found Amber's pack. It lay in the middle of the trail, dumped rather than set down, its contents partially spilled. Water bottles, energy bars, survey equipment, Amber's personal first aid kit with her name in Sharpie on the outside. but no blood, no signs of struggle beyond the scattered contents, nothing to indicate violence had occurred here. Stephanie keyed her radio. "Base, this is Walsh. I found Santiago's pack at approximately mile 6, elevation 9,400. Pack appears abandoned, but no immediate signs of injury or distress. Continuing to her last known position." "Copy that, Walsh. Be advised we're tracking unusual atmospheric readings in your area. Temperature sensors are showing significant localized cooling. Recommendation is..." Static consumed the transmission. "Base, you're breaking up. Repeat last." Nothing but the hiss of dead air and something underneath it. Something that might have been wind, or might have been breathing, or might have been her imagination. Stephanie switched frequencies, tried raising dispatch directly. Same static. Her GPS unit still showed her position accurately. Technology that relied on satellite signals rather than line-of-sight radio. But all voice communication had been cut off, as completely as if someone had thrown a switch. She was alone. The smart thing would be to turn back, return to radio range, wait for the SAR team. The smart thing would be to acknowledge that she was a single ranger, with a history of trauma, responding to a situation that had already claimed one colleague and might easily claim another. But Amber was out here somewhere. Amber, who was 23 and brilliant and reminded Stephanie too much of Rachel, who had made that sound of pure terror over the radio before going silent. Stephanie continued climbing. The trail became steeper, more exposed. She crossed a section of loose talus where every step required careful placement, where a twisted ankle would be catastrophic. The cold had become painful now, despite her layered clothing and continuing physical exertion. Her core temperature felt wrong, as if the cold was bypassing normal thermal regulation and attacking directly. At 8 miles, she found blood. Not a lot. Just drops, dark against the pale granite, leading off-trail toward a jumbled section of boulders. Stephanie followed them, one hand on the bear spray clipped to her belt, useless against most threats, but better than nothing, her other hand free for balance. The boulders formed a maze of passages barely wide enough for human navigation. The blood trail led into them, marking the stone in a pattern that suggested someone had been moving quickly, carelessly, pressing against rocks that scraped and cut. "Amber!" Stephanie's shout echoed off stone, came back to her distorted. "Amber Santiago, if you can hear me, respond." For 3 heartbeats, nothing, then faintly from deep within the boulder field, "Help." The voice was weak, thready, barely audible, but it was human. It was Amber. Stephanie squeezed into the boulder maze, following the blood, following the voice. The passages twisted, narrowed, opened into small chambers before constricting again, claustrophobic, disorienting. The kind of terrain where people got wedged and died slowly, while rescuers worked frantically above them. She found Amber in a chamber about 10 feet across, huddled against the far wall with her knees drawn up to her chest, her ranger uniform torn and filthy, her face pale as bone. Blood crusted her left forearm where fabric had been shredded along with skin. "Stephanie," Amber's voice cracked. "You came." "Of course I came." Stephanie moved carefully into the chamber, assessing. The arm wound looked bad, but not immediately life-threatening. Jagged lacerations consistent with being scraped against rough granite, dirty and probably requiring stitches, but no arterial involvement. Amber's pupils were equal and reactive, no obvious head trauma. Mild hypothermia based on her shivering and pale skin. Severe psychological distress evident in her body language and the way her eyes wouldn't stop scanning the chamber's entrance. "What happened?" Stephanie asked, pulling out her first aid kit, beginning to clean the arm wound with antiseptic wipes. "Something followed me." Amber's voice was flat, shock-toned. "From about mile 4. I thought it was an animal at first. Heard something moving parallel to the trail, just out of sight, but animals don't follow hikers for miles. They spook and run, or they ignore you, or they approach directly if they're dangerous. This stalked me. Deliberately. Intelligently. Did you see it? Glimpses. Through the trees. It moved wrong, Stephanie, too fast, too fluid, and the cold started, like it brought winter with it. Stephanie wrapped the arm wound with gauze, her hands working automatically while her mind processed Amber's description. Stalking behavior, unnatural cold, movement that violated normal kinetic expectations. These were not typical wildlife characteristics. These were... She stopped that thought before it fully formed. Focus on immediate concerns. Stabilize Amber. Get back to radio range. Report. Let experts determine what had happened out here. We're leaving, she said. Can you walk? Amber nodded. I think so. My ankle's twisted but not broken. I can... The temperature plummeted. In the space of a single breath, the cold went from painful to agonizing, from unusual to impossible. Stephanie's exhaled breath didn't just fog. It crystallized, ice forming in midair and falling as tiny, glittering particles. The stone walls of their chamber developed frost patterns, feather-like crystal formations, spreading across granite that had been bare seconds before. And something screamed. Not an animal scream. Not human. Something between the two, a sound that combined the throaty rage of a predator with the higher-pitched elements of human vocal cords stretched beyond their design parameters. It came from somewhere in the boulder maze, echoing off stone, seeming to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. Amber grabbed Stephanie's arm with strength born from terror. That's it! That's what chased me! Stephanie's training screamed conflicting protocols: shelter in place, avoid the threat, protect the civilian, radio for help, assess the danger, retreat tactically. But her radio was dead. There was no shelter, and Amber was injured and terrified and her responsibility. Stay behind me, Stephanie said, pulling out the bear spray. We're going back the way I came. Move quickly but carefully. Do not run unless I tell you to run. They squeezed back into the boulder maze's passages, Stephanie leading, Amber clinging to her pack. The cold burned now, painful on exposed skin, making metal equipment dangerous to touch with bare hands. Stephanie's breath came in ragged clouds, her lungs protesting the supercooled air. Something moved in the passages ahead, not clearly. Just a suggestion of motion. A shadow that was too solid, that occupied space in a way shadows shouldn't. It flowed between boulders, keeping pace with them, but staying ahead, corralling them toward what? Deeper into the maze, away from the trail. Stephanie changed direction, choosing a passage that angled back toward the trail, toward open ground, where whatever this was couldn't use the terrain against them. The shadow blocked their path. It resolved for just a moment into something almost visible, tall, emaciated, with limbs too long and joints that bent wrong, a face that might have been human once, but had been stretched and distorted until it resembled something carved from ice and hunger. Its eyes reflected light that wasn't there, gleaming with an intelligence that was worse than animal cunning, because it was recognizable as human intelligence corrupted into something monstrous. Stephanie triggered the bear spray directly at it. The capsaicin stream hit the thing, and it screamed again, that hybrid sound of beast and person staggering backward. But not from pain, from offense, as if the spray had violated some rule it expected her to follow. It recovered almost instantly, lunging forward with speed that defied physics. Run! Stephanie shoved Amber toward the nearest passage. Go, go, go! They ran. The boulder maze became a nightmarish blur of stone and cold, and that thing pursuing them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes seeming to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Stephanie lost track of direction, focused only on keeping Amber moving, on finding passages that led out rather than deeper in. Her hand found open air, They burst from the boulder field onto the exposed trail, stumbling into sunshine that felt shockingly warm after the glacial cold of the maze. Stephanie spun, bear spray ready, expecting the thing to follow. Nothing emerged. The boulder field sat silent, frost still coating the rocks nearest the passages, but whatever had chased them had stopped at the boundary between maze and trail. Territorial. Some part of Stephanie's mind catalogued. It doesn't want to leave its hunting ground. "Move!" she gasped. "Back toward trailhead. Now!" They moved, Amber limping but mobile, Stephanie constantly checking behind them. The cold receded as they put distance between themselves and the boulder field, temperature returning to normal summer ranges. At mile 7, Stephanie's radio crackled back to life. "Alsh, come in. Walsh, respond." She grabbed the radio. "This is Walsh. I have Santiago. We're mobile, descending approximately mile 7, requesting immediate evacuation and medical support at trailhead." "I copy that. Are you injured? What's your status?" "Santiago has moderate lacerations and possible mild hypothermia. I'm uninjured. We encountered..." She paused, uncertain how to report what they'd experienced in language that wouldn't get her flagged for psychological evaluation. "Unusual wildlife. Request full SAR team deployed to secure area." "Negative on wildlife reports from other hikers. What species?" Stephanie looked at Amber, whose eyes reflected the same uncertainty. "How do you report encountering something that violated natural law? How do you tell your superiors that something impossible had hunted you through boulder fields while manifesting winter in the middle of July?" "Unknown species," she said finally. "Large, aggressive, exhibited unusual behavior. Recommend area closure until properly assessed." They reached the trailhead 3 hours later, emerging from the wilderness to find an ambulance waiting, along with Chief Brennan, 2 SAR team members, and the kind of organized chaos that came with a successful rescue operation. Paramedics descended on Amber immediately. Brennan pulled Stephanie aside while they worked. "What really happened up there?" he asked quietly. Stephanie chose her words carefully. "Something chased us. I don't know what it was. It moved wrong, created localized cold that shouldn't be meteorologically possible, and demonstrated hunting behavior more sophisticated than any wildlife I've encountered in 20 years of backcountry work." Brennan's weathered face showed skepticism and concern in equal measure. "You want me to close 11 miles of trail based on something weird? I want you to send a properly equipped team to investigate. Bring thermal imaging, wildlife cameras, maybe fish and game involvement. Something is in that boulder field at mile 8, and it's dangerous." To his credit, Brennan didn't dismiss her outright. "I'll send a team tomorrow morning, full safety protocols. If they confirm unusual activity, we'll consider temporary closure." He paused. "You did good work today, Walsh. You brought her back." But Stephanie barely heard him. She was watching Amber being loaded into the ambulance, watching the young ranger's eyes scan the tree line with the perpetual vigilance of prey, and thinking about the thing they'd encountered. Thinking about how it had moved with such intelligence, such purpose, such hunger. That night in her ranger housing unit, Stephanie couldn't sleep. She lay in darkness, listening to wind move through pines outside her window and researching on her laptop, searching for anything that matched what they'd experienced. Most results were useless tourist folklore about Bigfoot and urban legends. But eventually, she found references to Algonquian mythology, to stories of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of winter and starvation that transformed humans into monsters, that embodied insatiable hunger, that hunted in the deep wilderness and left cold in its wake. The descriptions matched, too precisely to be coincidence. But Wendigo were First Nations mythology from the Great Lakes and Canada, not the Rocky Mountains. The Tetons had their own indigenous history, Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, but not the specific cultural traditions that had created Wendigo stories. Unless. Stephanie refined her search, adding terms about Grand Teton history, about early expeditions. Found a reference to the Spaulding-Peterson Party of 1927. 6 climbers and 2 guides who had entered Alaska Basin in October for a late-season mountaineering attempt. An early snowstorm trapped them for 3 weeks. When rescuers finally reached them in mid-November, they found only 2 survivors, both incoherent and suffering from severe frostbite and starvation. The official report mentioned unfortunate dietary necessities during extreme survival conditions. Cannibalism in Alaska Basin 81 years ago. One of the survivors, a climber named Thomas Hewitt from Ontario, had been confined to a psychiatric facility after repeatedly insisting that something had come into their camp during the starvation period, had whispered to them in the darkness, had promised them relief from hunger if they would just take the first bite. He died in institutional care in 1934, still raving about the thing in the mountains that ate human souls and transformed men into frozen hunger. Stephanie closed the laptop, her hands trembling. She didn't believe in supernatural entities. She believed in psychological trauma, in environmental stresses, in the ways that human perception could break down under extreme conditions. She believed in rational explanations, but she also believed in what she'd seen, in the thing that had stalked them through the boulder field, that had manifested impossible cold, that had moved with intelligence and hunger, and something that felt older than the mountains themselves. The SAR team went into Alaska Basin the next morning. 4 rangers, properly equipped, tasked with investigating the boulder field at Mile 8 and retrieving Amber's abandoned survey equipment. They found her pack and scattered supplies. They found the blood trail. They found the frost patterns on the rocks, still present despite a night of normal July temperatures. They found tracks, not human, not quite animal, impressions in soft earth showing something bipedal but wrong, with foot anatomy that shouldn't exist, spaced in strides too long for any human gait. The tracks circled the boulder field in patterns that suggested territorial pacing, that implied intelligence enough to recognize boundaries. Brennan closed the Alaska Basin Trail pending environmental assessment and wildlife evaluation. The official reason cited concerns about a potentially aggressive large predator, species undetermined. Unofficially, the rangers who'd gone in came back spooked, unwilling to discuss details, but clearly having encountered something that shook their professional composure. Amber Santiago resigned 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. She left Wyoming without saying goodbye, though she sent Stephanie a text message from her parents' house in New Mexico. "Thank you for coming for me. I can't go back. I can't explain what we saw, but it was real. It's still there. Be careful." Stephanie didn't resign. She couldn't. Because if something was hunting in Alaska Basin, something that had transformed humans through starvation and cold 80 years ago and still lingered in those high places, then someone needed to watch. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to warn the next eager young ranger who wanted to conduct wildlife surveys in Death Canyon. She requested permanent assignment to Backcountry Patrol. Got it, partly because of her successful rescue of Amber, partly because few rangers wanted the isolated, demanding work. She spent the rest of that summer and the subsequent years hiking the Teton wilderness, documenting, observing, watching for signs that the thing in the boulder field was expanding its territory. It never left Alaska Basin. But occasionally, when weather turned cold and storms rolled through in shoulder seasons, Stephanie would find things. Tracks that shouldn't exist. Frost patterns in sheltered areas where temperature shouldn't drop. Once a deer carcass stripped completely of flesh, but with the bones arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than scavenger feeding. She photographed everything, kept detailed logs, built a file that she shared with no one because she knew how it would sound. The traumatized ranger who'd lost her partner and now saw monsters in every shadow. But on winter nights, when wind howled through the mountains, Stephanie would sometimes wake to the sound of something screaming in the distance. Not quite animal, not quite human, a sound of hunger that could never be satisfied. And she would check her windows, would make sure her doors were locked, would remember the way the thing in the boulder field had looked at her with stolen human intelligence and absolute predatory focus. She'd saved Amber, had brought her back from the wilderness alive, had done what she'd failed to do for Rachel, but she knew, with a certainty that lived deeper than rational thought, that she hadn't defeated the thing in Alaska Basin, hadn't even hurt it, had simply survived because it chose to let her survive, because one ranger escaping to spread fear and stories served its purposes better than one more meal. The Wendigo, if that's what it was, had been patient for 80 years. It could wait longer, could wait for the next party of hikers to get trapped by early snow, for the next desperate soul to violate the boundaries between human and monster, for the next opportunity to feed on terror and transformation and the particular flavor of human souls consumed by hunger. Stephanie kept hiking into Alaska Basin every few months, always in daylight, always properly equipped, documenting the signs that something unnatural hunted there. She told herself it was professional diligence, fulfilling her duty as a ranger to monitor potential hazards. But really, she was keeping vigil, standing watch over something that couldn't be killed or captured or explained in language that rational minds would accept. Because some hunts never end, some predators never die, and some wilderness areas remain wild, not despite human presence, but because something older and hungrier has claimed them first. On clear nights, she could see Alaska Basin from her ranger housing, a dark notch in the mountains where starlight seemed dimmer than it should be. And sometimes, though she told herself it was imagination, she thought she could see something moving up there. A pale figure in terrain too exposed for nighttime travel, pacing the boundaries of its territory, waiting with the patience of something that had already consumed time itself. Rachel had died to equipment failure and statistical impossibility. Amber had nearly died to something far worse. And Stephanie lived, suspended between the two, carrying knowledge that isolated her more completely than any mountain range could. She kept Rachel's photograph on her desk at the ranger station, young, smiling, alive in a moment before gravity and bad luck had transformed her into memory. Next to it, she placed a printout of the Wendigo folklore she'd researched, a reminder that some deaths were preventable and some were unavoidable, and some were caused by things that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. The Teton Range rose outside her window, magnificent and indifferent, holding secrets in its high basins that predated human language. And somewhere in those secrets, in the boulder fields of Alaska Basin where frost formed in July and screams echoed on windless nights, something waited, hungry, patient, still hunting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Stephen Torres woke to his son screaming. The sound pulled him from sleep with the violence of a drowning man breaking the surface. One moment he was dreaming about his late wife's laugh. The next, he was running down the hallway of their ranger housing, heart slamming against his ribs, his 11-year-old's terror echoing off the log walls. He hit the light switch. Nothing happened. Power was out again, third time this week. The Olympic Peninsula's constant rain played havoc with the electrical lines. "Dad!" Jamie's voice cracked on the word. "Dad, there's someone in my room!" Stephen grabbed the mag light from the hall table and burst through Jamie's door, sweeping the beam across the small bedroom. Empty. Window closed, but the air, Christ, the air reeked of wet earth and something underneath it, something organic and wrong that made Stephen's throat tighten. And there, spreading across the hardwood floor from the window to Jamie's bed, a trail of fresh black soil mixed with something that glistened in the flashlight beam. Jamie sat pressed against his headboard, blankets clutched to his chest, his face pale in the maglight's glare. "He was standing right there," the boy whispered, pointing to the foot of his bed. "Right there, Dad, looking at me. He didn't blink, not once." "Who, buddy? Who was looking at you?" "I don't know, but he smelled like when we found that dead elk last month, remember? When it had been dead for a while." Stephen's hand found the light switch instinctively, even though he knew the power was out. His mind was cataloging details with the trained efficiency of 15 years in law enforcement. The soil trail was too fresh, still damp. The window was latched from the inside. They were on the second floor of the ranger housing. No tree branches close enough to reach, no ladder outside. The muddy footprints were adult-sized, barefoot, and they stopped at the bed. Just stopped, as if whoever made them had simply vanished, or climbed in with Jamie. Stephen crossed to the window, examining the glass. On the outside surface, at eye level, muddy fingerprints. 5 of them pressed against the pane with enough force to leave smears. Stephen's flashlight beam revealed something else that made his stomach drop. The prints were on the outside of a second-story window, but the angles were wrong. The fingers had been pointing downward, as if whatever made them had been hanging upside down against the glass, looking in. "Get dressed," Stephen said, keeping his voice steady for Jamie's sake. "Pack a bag, we're going to the station." "It's 3 a.m. "I don't care. Move." While Jamie dressed, Stephen checked the rest of the house. More soil traces in the hallway, a few on the stairs leading to the front door, which stood slightly ajar, despite Stephen's certainty that he'd locked it before bed. He always locked it. Ever since Kelly died 2 years ago in the car accident, he'd been obsessive about locks and smoke detectors and having an emergency plan. Single father paranoia, his fellow rangers called it. Now, staring at the open door and the trail of grave dirt leading inside, he wondered if paranoia had been justified all along. His cell phone showed 3:17 a.m. and no signal, standard for this part of Olympic National Park, where mountains and rainforest created dead zones that even the best towers couldn't penetrate. Stephen's ranger housing sat on the edge of the Hoh Rainforest, one of the most isolated postings in the park system, surrounded by 140 inches of annual rainfall and trees that had been growing since before Columbus. Beautiful during the day, suffocating at night. They took Stephen's truck, a 2002 Ford Ranger with mud tires and a rack of emergency lights that he activated despite the empty pre-dawn roads. Jamie sat silent in the passenger seat, still pale, clutching a backpack with his Nintendo Game Boy and a change of clothes. Stephen wanted to ask more questions about the figure in his room, but part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to put words to the dread growing in his chest, like frost spreading across glass. The ranger station was 12 miles away, a drive that took 25 minutes on the winding forest roads. Stephen made it in 18, his headlights cutting through mist that rose from the ground like exhalation. Twice he thought he saw movement in the trees, something keeping pace with the truck, loping on 4 legs or possibly 2, hard to tell through the fog and the Douglas firs that crowded the roadside like witnesses. The station was dark, except for the emergency lights. Stephen parked and hustled Jamie inside, locking the door behind them and immediately checking the windows. All secure. The building was concrete and steel, built in the 1970s, when the Park Service still prioritized function over aesthetics. It smelled like coffee and old paper and the mildew that crept into everything on the peninsula, despite best efforts. "Stay in the break room," Stephen told Jamie. "Lock the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." "Where are you going?" "To check something. I'll be right back." Stephen's office was a small room cluttered with incident reports, trail maps, and photographs of the park's various ecosystems. He pulled up the missing persons database on his desktop computer. The station had satellite internet that actually worked, and entered search parameters. Juvenile male, Olympic National Park, last 30 days. 3 results. 3 boys, all around Dylan Morrison's age. all reported missing while hiking with their families in different sections of the park. All vanished without a trace, despite extensive search operations. Stephen had participated in 2 of the searches himself. Standard assumption had been that they'd gotten lost, fallen into ravines, been taken by the elements or wild animals. Olympic could kill you 100 different ways if you didn't respect it. But now, Stephen pulled up the incident details and saw patterns he'd missed before. Each disappearance had occurred on a night with no moon. Each family had reported strange occurrences before the boy vanished. Livestock acting disturbed, unusual animal sounds near their campsites, family members experiencing vivid nightmares about being watched. And in 2 cases, investigators had found traces of disturbed earth near the last known locations, as if something had been digging. Stephen's phone rang. His work landline, not the cell. He grabbed it. Olympic Station, Ranger Torres. Stephen. The voice was Robert Morrison's, Dylan's father, hoarse with exhaustion and fear. Stephen, you need to get to the hospital. It's Dylan. He's back. The drive to Forks Community Hospital took 40 minutes. Stephen brought Jamie, unwilling to leave him alone even in the locked station. The boy fell asleep against the passenger window, exhausted, while Stephen's mind raced through impossible scenarios. Dylan Morrison had been missing for 72 hours, vanished from a family camping trip near the Kinnaul River. Massive search operation, dogs, helicopter with thermal imaging, volunteers from 3 counties. Nothing. And now he was back? Robert Morrison met them in the hospital parking lot. The man looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. Unshaven, eyes red-rimmed, shirt buttoned wrong. They found him walking on Highway 101 about 2 hours ago, Robert said. Just walking, barefoot, covered in mud. He won't talk, won't say where he's been or what happened. The doctors can't find anything physically wrong with him. But Stephen, his eyes, there's something wrong with his eyes. Jamie stirred awake as they entered the hospital. The fluorescent lights made everything look sterile and false. A doctor met them outside Dylan's room, Dr. Patricia Chen, ER attending, looking puzzled and concerned in equal measure. He's stable, she said. Vitals are normal. No signs of dehydration or malnutrition despite being missing for 3 days. No injuries, but his behavior is... She paused, searching for words. Dissociative. He responds to simple commands but doesn't speak. And there's one other thing. She led them to Dylan's room. Through the observation window, Stephen saw the 12-year-old boy sitting on the examination table, hospital gown hanging loose on his thin frame. His parents stood nearby, his mother crying silently. Dylan stared straight ahead, unblinking, his face slack and empty as a mannequin's. His core body temperature is 87 degrees, Dr. Chen said quietly. That's hypothermic range. Should be causing severe symptoms, confusion, loss of coordination, cardiac arrhythmia. But he's functioning normally except for the non-responsive behavior. And when we drew blood, the lab ran it twice because they thought there was a contamination. There's something in his system that shouldn't be there. Elevated levels of cadaverine and putrescine, compounds associated with decomposition. Stephen's mouth went dry. What does that mean? I don't know. I've contacted a specialist at Seattle Medical, but they can't get anyone here until tomorrow morning. For now, we're keeping him under observation. Dr. Chen glanced through the window at Dylan, and Stephen saw something flicker across her professional composure. Fear. Ranger Torres, in your experience with wildlife and environmental factors in the park, have you ever heard of anything that could cause this? Stephen thought about the mud in Jamie's room, the footprints on the second-story window pointing downward, the 3 other missing boys, the smell of rot and earth. No, he lied. Nothing like this. Jamie pressed his face against the observation window. Dylan, he called out. Dylan, it's me, Jamie. The boy on the examination table turned his head, too smoothly, like it was mounted on ball bearings instead of vertebrae. His eyes found Jamie through the glass, and Stephen felt his son go rigid beside him. "Dad," Jamie whispered. "Dad, that's not Dylan." "What do you mean, buddy?" "That's not him. It looks like him, but it's not. His eyes, they're wrong, like the man in my room. They don't blink right. They blink sideways." Stephen looked closer. Dylan's eyes were tracking Jamie, and as he watched, the boy's eyelids closed, but not from top to bottom. They closed from the sides, nictitating membranes sliding across the corneas like a reptile's. There and gone so fast, Stephen almost missed it. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Dylan's mouth opened. His lips moved, forming words without sound. Stephen couldn't hear through the glass, but he could read lips well enough after years of working in high-wind environments where shouted conversations were the norm. The boy was saying the same two words over and over. "He's coming, he's coming, he's coming." Stephen grabbed Jamie and Robert Morrison, pulling them away from the window. "We need to leave now." "What? Why?" Robert looked at him like he was insane. "That's my son in there." "That's not your son." Stephen's ranger training warred with his rational mind, the part that insisted this was impossible, that there had to be a logical explanation. But he'd seen too much in the past few hours to cling to logic. "Something's wrong. Something's very wrong, and we need to get somewhere safe." The lights went out. Emergency generators kicked in after 3 seconds, bathing the hospital corridor in red emergency lighting. Through the observation window, Dylan's room was dark, except for the exit sign above the door. Stephen could see the boy's silhouette, standing now, facing the glass. His eyes reflected the red light like an animal's, twin coins of crimson shine. Then he smiled, and his mouth was full of too many teeth. The observation window exploded outward. Safety glass turned to pellets that sprayed across the corridor. Dylan, the thing wearing Dylan, climbed through the shattered frame with movements that were liquid and wrong, joints bending in directions that would shatter bones. His mother screamed. His father lunged forward, trying to reach him, and the creature that had been Dylan moved faster than anything human should move, crossing 10 feet in an instant and sinking its teeth into Robert Morrison's throat. Blood sprayed in arterial jets, painting the walls, the floor, Stephen's face. He grabbed Jamie and ran, pulling the boy away from the scene, away from Robert's gurgling screams and his wife's shrieks and the wet tearing sounds that his brain refused to process. Behind them, the hospital erupted into chaos. Alarms, shouting, the creatures snarling that sounded like a rabid dog, crossed with something that had learned to speak and forgotten how. They made it to the parking lot. Stephen threw Jamie into the truck, fired the engine, and peeled out as people in hospital scrubs ran from the building. In his rearview mirror, he saw the thing that looked like Dylan Morrison standing in the emergency room entrance, covered in Robert Morrison's blood, watching them leave with eyes that reflected red in the taillights. Jamie was sobbing. Stephen drove, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his mind fracturing. What he'd just seen was impossible. Medically impossible. Physically impossible. But it had happened. He'd watched it happen. "The man in my room," Jamie managed through his tears. That's what he looked like. His eyes, the way he moved. "Dad, what's happening?" Stephen's phone rang, his personal cell, signal somehow working despite the dead zone. He answered on speaker. "Torres. Ranger Torres, this is Magda Popescu." The voice was elderly, heavily accented, Eastern European, Romanian maybe. "You don't know me, but I live in Forks. I'm calling because I heard on the scanner about the boy at the hospital, about what he did, and I think I know what's happening to these children." "Who is this? How did you get my number?" "Directory assistance, Mr. Torres. Please. I know you won't believe me, but you must listen. What you're dealing with, we have a name for it in my country. Strigoi, the undead, the ones who return. Stephen's rational mind wanted to hang up, to dismiss this as a crank call, but his hands kept the phone pressed to his ear. That's folklore, ghost stories. Yes, ghost stories we told because they were true. I came to America in 1952, Mr. Torres. I came because my village in Romania was destroyed by what you call ghost stories. I've been tracking similar incidents in your park for 3 years now. The missing children, the livestock deaths, the reports of disturbed graves in the old pioneer cemetery near Lake Crescent. This is not the first time Strigoi have manifested in Olympic, but it's getting worse. Something is calling them. Something or someone. Even if I believed you, which I don't, what am I supposed to do about it? You protect your son. Because Strigoi don't take children randomly, Mr. Torres. They choose them. They mark them. And if your boy has seen one and survived, he's been marked for transformation. The creature will come for him. Probably tonight, probably when the moon sets and the darkest part of night arrives. That's when they're strongest. How do I stop it? Silence on the line. Rain hammered Stephen's windshield, the Olympic Peninsula performing its nightly baptism. Finally, Magda spoke. In the old country, we had methods. Hawthorne stakes through the heart, beheading and burning the body, exhumation and proper burial rites. But those only work if you can find the original corpse, the first Strigoi, the one that's creating the others. Kill that, and the transformations stop. The newly turned might be saved. Dylan Morrison, if he's been turned, like you say, he can still be saved. But only if you destroy the Master Strigoi. And to do that, you need to find where it rests during the day. Strigoi are corpses, Mr. Torres. They need to return to their grave soil to regenerate. Look for disturbed earth, for places where the dead should rest, but don't. The call ended. Stephen stared at his phone, then at Jamie, who'd stopped crying and was listening with the wide-eyed intensity of a child trying to make sense of an adult world gone mad. Dad, Mrs. Popescu used to bring cookies to school on Romanian holidays. She told us stories about vampires, but they weren't like in movies. She said real vampires were just dead people who came back wrong. Jamie, I believe her. I believe it because I saw that thing in my room, and it wasn't alive, Dad. It was dead but moving, like Dylan. Dylan's dead, isn't he? He died in the woods, and something brought him back. Stephen wanted to deny it, wanted to tell his son that there were logical explanations, that science and reason would prevail, that monsters weren't real. But he'd watched a 12-year-old boy tear out a man's throat with inhuman strength and speed. He'd seen the blood, smelled the death, felt the wrongness radiating from Dylan's transformed body, like heat from a fire. Yeah, Stephen said quietly. I think he is. They drove to the ranger station, and Stephen armed himself. His service weapon, a Glock 22, that would be useless against what they were facing but provided psychological comfort. His backup pistol, 2 maglights, his emergency radio, a GPS unit, a first aid kit that wouldn't help against the undead, but might help against everything else the Olympic wilderness could throw at them. He also grabbed 2 items from the evidence locker. A combat knife from a previous arrest, 8 inches of carbon steel, and a small hatchet confiscated from illegal tree cutting. Not hawthorn stakes, but sharp metal that could sever a spine. Where are we going? Jamie asked. To find where it's sleeping. If Mrs. Popescu is right, and God help me, I think she is, we need to find the original Strigoi, the one that created Dylan, the one that came into our house tonight. Stephen pulled up a topographical map of Olympic National Park on his computer and marked locations. The 3 other missing boys' last known positions, Dylan's campsite, his own ranger housing. They formed a rough circle about 15 miles in diameter, centered on an area near Lake Quinault. There, Stephen said, tapping the screen. Old Rainier Cemetery, established in 1897, abandoned in the 1940s, when they relocated most of the bodies to Forks. But the historical records show at least 30 graves that were never successfully exhumed. Ground was too wet, too unstable. Some of the dead just stayed. And you think that's where it is? Only one way to find out. They left at first light, the perpetual Olympic rain turning from darkness to grey dawn without ever actually becoming day. Stephen had called Tom Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, the senior ranger and his supervisor, and left a voicemail explaining where he was going and why, knowing it sounded insane, hoping that if he didn't come back, someone would at least know where to search. He didn't mention Strigoi, just said he was investigating a lead on the missing children cases. The drive to Lake Quinault took 90 minutes on logging roads that were more mud than gravel. Jamie stayed quiet, playing his Game Boy with the sound off, occasionally looking out the window at the forest, pressing close on both sides. The rainforest here was primordial. Sitka spruce and western hemlock that reached 200 feet tall, their trunks draped in moss that hung like burial shrouds, the ground thick with ferns and rotting logs that fed new growth in the endless cycle of death and renewal. Old Rainier Cemetery wasn't marked on modern maps. Stephen found it using GPS coordinates from historical documents, following a trail that had been overgrown for decades. They parked and continued on foot, Stephen carrying the hatchet and knife, Jamie staying close behind him. The cemetery appeared through the mist like a wound in the forest. Headstones leaned at drunken angles, some fallen completely, others so weathered the names were illegible. The ground was torn up in multiple places, fresh excavations, black soil mounded around holes that descended into darkness. The smell hit them before they reached the fence, rot and wet earth, and something sweetly nauseating that Stephen's brain insisted was decomposition. "Stay behind me," Stephen whispered. They moved between the graves, Stephen's maglite sweeping across the disturbed earth. Some of the holes were shallow, just a few feet deep. Others went down far enough that the flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. At the center of the cemetery, beneath a stone angel whose face had eroded away, Stephen found what he was looking for. A grave that had been excavated from below. Dirt pushed up from inside, as if something had clawed its way to the surface. The headstone was partially legible. "Here lies Urianu, died 19. May he find peace." "Murianu," a voice said behind them. Stephen spun, raising the hatchet. Magda Popescu stood at the cemetery entrance, leaning on a wooden cane, her ancient face creased with lines that spoke of decades of knowledge and sorrow. She wore a heavy coat despite the June weather and carried a canvas bag that bulged with angular shapes. "The grave says Murianu," she continued, approaching slowly. "I've been researching the old cemetery records. Nicolae Murianu, Romanian immigrant, died in 1903 under suspicious circumstances. The local doctor noted unusual post-mortem changes in his report. The body remained too flexible, showed no rigor mortis, appeared to have moved in the coffin after death. Classic signs of Strigoi transformation. But this was America, and nobody believed in such things, so they buried him anyway. And now he's awake," Stephen said. "Now he's awake, and hungry, and creating others like him." Magda reached into her bag and produced 3 wooden stakes, their tips carved to wicked points. "Hawthorne, I've kept these for years, hoping I'd never need them. But I've been watching the patterns, Mr. Torres, the missing children, the animal deaths. I knew it was only a matter of time. How do we kill it? We find it in its daytime rest. We stake it through the heart. We remove the head. We burn both separately." She handed him the stakes. "Simple in theory, difficult in practice because Strigoi are cunning. They hide, they set traps. And if we fail, if we allow it to wake and transform before we finish the ritual, we die." Jamie gripped Stephen's sleeve. "Dad, I don't want to do this. Neither do I, buddy. But if we don't, that thing comes for you tonight, and I won't let that happen." They descended into the excavated grave, Stephen first, then Jamie, then Magda, moving with surprising agility for her age. The tunnel beneath the casket angled sharply downward, following what might have been an old animal burrow, or might have been something the Strigoi had dug itself over decades of nocturnal activity. The walls were slick with moisture and something else, something organic that squelched under Stephen's hands as he crawled. The tunnel opened into a chamber, a natural cavity in the bedrock that had been expanded by years of clawing. Stephen's flashlight beam revealed a nightmare. Bones scattered across the floor, some animal, but some disturbingly human-sized. Clothing scraps that might have belonged to the missing boys. And in the center, curled in a depression filled with grave dirt, a figure. It had been a man once, Nicolae Murianu, if Magda was right. But a century of death and unnatural animation had transformed it into something that only approximated human form. The skin was grey-white, mottled with liver spots and patches of fungal growth. The fingers were elongated, nails grown into yellowed claws. The face, Christ, the face still bore traces of what Murianu had been. But the eyes were sunken hollows, and the mouth was a lipless gash full of broken teeth. It was sleeping, or resting, or whatever Strigoi did during daylight hours when their unnatural vitality waned. "Now," Magda whispered, pressing a stake into Stephen's hand. "Before it wakes." Stephen approached the creature, raised the stake, aimed for where the heart should be. The Strigoi's eyes snapped open. They were white, completely white. No iris or pupil, just milky cataracts that somehow still saw. The creature's mouth opened in a scream that was less sound than sensation, a vibration that rattled Stephen's bones and made Jamie cry out. It rose with impossible speed, knocking Stephen backward, the stake flying from his hand. Magda lunged forward, driving her own stake toward the creature's chest. It caught her wrist with one clawed hand, twisted, and Stephen heard bones snap. The old woman gasped, but didn't scream, kicking at the Strigoi's legs, trying to create distance. Stephen grabbed the hatchet from his belt and swung. The blade bit into the creature's shoulder, cutting through desiccated muscle and scraping bone. Black fluid, not blood, something thicker and fouler, sprayed across the chamber walls. The Strigoi released Magda and turned on Stephen, its white eyes fixing on him with predatory intelligence. "You," it said, and its voice was wind through a graveyard, dry leaves and rattling breath. "You who would destroy me. You who would end my feeding." It moved closer, hunching under the low ceiling. "I know your fear, Stephen Torres. I tasted it when I visited your home. When I looked through your son's window and saw the delicious terror in his sleeping face. I know everything about you now. Stay away from my son. But he's so young, so full of warm life. When I transform him, and I will, once I've fed enough to regain my strength, he'll be like Dylan, forever young, forever hungry, forever mine." Stephen swung the hatchet again. The Strigoi dodged with liquid grace, then was on him, impossibly strong hands gripping his throat. Stephen's vision began to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges, the hatchet falling from nerveless fingers. Jamie drove the fallen hawthorn stake into the creature's back. The boy had grabbed the stake Stephen had dropped and rammed it between the Strigoi's shoulder blades with all the strength his 11-year-old frame possessed. It didn't penetrate the heart. The angle was wrong, but it went deep enough to make the creature release Stephen and spin toward this new threat. "No!" Stephen lunged, grabbing the Strigoi from behind, wrapping his arms around its torso in a bear hug that pinned its arms. The creature thrashed, its strength overwhelming, but Stephen held on, aware that he was embracing a corpse, that the thing in his arms was dead tissue, animated by hunger and rage, and something older than any folklore could explain. "Jamie! The stake! Drive it through!" The boy understood. He grabbed a second stake from where Magda had dropped it, positioned the point over the Strigoi's chest, and slammed his palm against the blunt end. The wood punched through desiccated skin and ribs that cracked like dry branches. The creature screamed. That same bone-rattling scream, and bucked in Stephen's grip with enough force to throw them both to the ground. Stephen felt the Strigoi's body seize, felt it stiffen, felt the unnatural vitality drain like water from a broken vessel. The white eyes dimmed, the clawed hands went slack, and Nicolae Mureanu became what he should have been a century ago, just a corpse, finally at rest. Magda struggled to her feet, cradling her broken wrist. Quickly, we must finish it. Head and heart separated and burned, or it might regenerate. Udi, they didn't have the tools to behead it properly, so Stephen used the hatchet, making a mess of what should have been surgical, but managing through repeated blows to sever the spine and separate the head from the body. Jamie threw up in the corner of the chamber, and Stephen didn't blame him. He wanted to do the same. They wrapped both pieces in the tarp Stephen had brought and hauled them to the surface. The rain had stopped. First break in the weather Stephen had seen all week. They piled deadwood and fallen branches in the cemetery's center, placed the Strigoi's remains on top, and used the emergency flares from Stephen's truck to ignite it. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming the century-old flesh with greedy flames that crackled and popped as moisture and other fluids boiled away. As the fire burned, Stephen's radio crackled to life. Tom Chen's voice urgent. "Torres, this is Chen. Respond immediately. We have a situation at Forks Hospital. Dylan Morrison has regained consciousness. He's speaking, seems oriented, doesn't remember anything after going missing. Dr. Chen says his body temperature is normalizing. Whatever was happening to him, it's reversing. Do you copy?" Stephen keyed his radio. "I copy, Tom. The situation is resolved. I'll brief you when I return to station." "What situation? Your voicemail didn't make any..." "Later, Tom. Torres out." Magda watched the fire with eyes that had seen too much. The other children, the ones taken before Dylan, they might also recover if we were quick enough, or they might be too far transformed. We won't know until we find them. And if they're too far gone? She didn't answer, didn't need to. Stephen understood. If the other boys had been dead too long, had been fed from too many times, had begun their own transformation into Strigoi, then they'd need to find them and repeat what they'd done today. Find them and end them before they could create more undead. The fire burned down to ash. Stephen stirred it with a stick, making sure nothing remained but carbon and bone fragments. The smell of burning flesh, even dead, animated flesh, would stay with him forever. He looked at Jamie, who sat on a fallen log, pale and shaking but alive. Still human. "Is it over?" the boy asked. Stephen wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that burning Nicolae Mureanu had ended the threat, that Olympic National Park could return to being just a beautiful, dangerous wilderness instead of a hunting ground for the undead. But he thought about the other missing boys, about the abandoned cemetery and the 30 graves that had never been properly exhumed, about the fact that Mureanu might not have been the only Strigoi resting in Olympic's rainforest. "For now," he said, "it's over for now." They buried the ashes, mixed them with salt and iron filings that Magda produced from her bag. Traditional methods, she explained, to bind the dead and prevent any resurrection. Then they returned to town, Stephen driving, while Magda gave him the names of other European immigrants who'd settled on the peninsula over the past century. Other families who'd brought their folklore and possibly their monsters across the Atlantic. Dylan Morrison recovered fully within 3 days. He remembered nothing after leaving his family's campsite to gather firewood. The other missing boys were found alive, disoriented, hypothermic, but alive, wandering the forest in various locations. All showed elevated levels of decomposition markers in their blood work that slowly normalized. Dr. Chen published a paper on unexplained hypothermic amnesia in pediatric wilderness exposure cases that baffled the medical community and was eventually dismissed as regional anomaly. Stephen Torres continued working as a ranger at Olympic National Park. He partnered with Magda Popescu, who proved to be a wealth of knowledge about the region's hidden history, the forgotten graves, the old superstitions, the stories that European immigrants had brought with them and tried to leave behind. Together, they quietly monitored the park for signs of supernatural activity, responding to reports of disturbed graves and missing persons with a level of awareness that other rangers lacked. Jamie grew up knowing that monsters were real. He handled it better than Stephen expected, though the boy refused to sleep with his window open and kept a hawthorn stake under his bed until he left for college. They never spoke about what happened in Old Rainier Cemetery, but it bonded them in ways that normal father-son relationships couldn't match. They'd faced death together, true death, the kind that walked and hungered and survived. 3 months after Nikolai Murianu's destruction, Stephen received a package at the ranger station. No return address. Inside, a leather-bound journal written in Romanian with English translations in the margins. Magda's handwriting. The journal documented 50 years of Strigoi activity in the Pacific Northwest, from 1903 to 1952, including detailed descriptions of other undead manifestations, their weaknesses and methods of destruction. A note was paper-clipped to the first page, for when you need it. And you will need it, Stephen. Olympic is beautiful, but it's old. And old places remember what modern people prefer to forget. The dead don't always stay buried here. Someone has to watch. Someone has to remember. Now that's you, MP. Stephen filed the journal in his desk's locked drawer, hoping he'd never need to reference it again. But he knew better. Olympic National Park stretched across nearly 1 million acres of wilderness, much of it unexplored, all of it old beyond human reckoning. If one Strigoi had found rest in its rainforest, others might too. And as long as Stephen Torres wore the ranger badge, as long as his son lived in the shadow of those ancient trees, he'd be watching. Because some stories aren't metaphors, some warnings are literal, and some monsters are just the dead who forgot to stay that way. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.